Ecstatic Bliss. Secrets to living a juicy life. When the ego dies, the soul can finally breathe. A phrase that came to me that I feel is very, very bringing to the point also what we are going through collectively. It's not so much ego versus soul, but more to develop a healthy ego and to be able to discern between this is now my ego playing out and this is actually truly my soul. And in today's episode, we want to look closer at this topic, ego death in particular, because ego death is a term that is used very, very often in the spiritual community nowadays, and sometimes also linked to the dark night of the soul, because both kind of are intertwined, so happen at the same time, and many people are experiencing ego death or multiple ego death, which is part of the so-called purging phase. If you remember the cycle we are going through from my one-on-one mentoring Soulgasm, purging we need in order to clear our channel, clear our system from outdated programs, from karma, from collective conditioning, from anything that is actually blurring the truth of who we truly are. And the ego is a very, very tough mechanism, which is actually also part of the game of forgetting. And in order to remember who we truly are, what we truly are, we need to work in a way that we can decipher what is the ego, when do I act out of ego. And ego death happens also often quite automatically, to be honest. We don't really have to force it or think in the way of, oh, I want to get rid of my ego, or I want to remove whatever my ego is so that I can live more in truth, in alignment with my soul. It's not that forced way. It's actually very, very organic, automatic. Just the surrender and the trust we need. And also to state here right in the beginning that the ego is not per se bad or something we have to destroy or shame away, because it is what, like I said, what keeps this game alive. The ego is that instance that keeps us separate, with protection mechanisms in place, in survival mode, control, in a sense also in lower vibrations such as fear, greed, or anger. And the ego is required so that consciousness can experience itself through us, that we can experience ourselves as a separate entity or identity, and so to forget our true nature, that we are everything, and then also to have this journey of remembrance again, that we are more than this limited self, more than this ego. Ego and soul are playing in that game, so to say, for consciousness to experience itself. And without that mechanism, there would be no deep contrast what we are not. Yeah, life happens in duality. Duality is part of life so that we can discern between one and the other. And maybe we can even say ego and soul are kind of like two poles of one coin. If you see soul as the emergence back into home frequency of the divine, and ego as a separate human self-identity. But without ego, we also wouldn't have a triggering of remembrance again. We wouldn't even have maybe this awakening ascension journey. And therefore, the ego, just to state that clearly again, is not something bad or to negate. It is part of our journey. But because we are raising in consciousness, humanity is, in a way, becoming more mature, we can also say, or cycling back to remembering who we truly are. it is natural that more ego death is happening currently on planet Earth, or also said ego dissolution. So we look behind the wheel of forgetting more and more and see, we are much, much more than these identities, these labels, these roles, these masks. In the modern view, we can say that ego death is seen as anything that is unmasking us, that is unmasking the ego. So there can be also multiple ego death, which for each turn reveals something more of the truth. It's like an unpeeling, this onion that is unlayered, to come back to the core essence of your being. But in some spiritual traditions, ego death is actually also seen as a path to enlightenment or union with a higher power, with the divine. So we can a little bit distinguish between ancient view of, ego death is just an incident or like a one-time event where the whole ego is dissolved, such as in deep meditation, samadhi experience, where the ego really dissolves and you become one again. You have this oneness experience and oneness consciousness that flow through you, which can also just be a glimpse. Usually it's not a state of being that you then take on. It's more like a glimpse of, this is my actual being, my grandness, my expansion, the divine essence of me. It's more so an experience, a moment in time than something that you carry on. But in modern day, it's more viewed as, anything also like tower moments, divine interventions, void states, all of this, which is interrelated with the ego death, that is in the modern view more perceived as the way of seeing it. But in essence, both takes us to the same, of unmasking, to see what we truly are, to lose our personal identification and merge back into more this expansive state of I am everything, or even I just am. Ego death is oftentimes quite painful, and that is why a lot of people are afraid of an ego death or don't really like to go through that phase. Why is it so painful? Because you thought you would be that limited self, this ego, the small self, and when ego death happens, that's why it's called death, the ego feels threatened. And it feels like dying, but it's actually just dying your outdated, your limited identity. Old identities are dying. And with this, all sorts of protection mechanisms usually come up to defend this limited self. Like even if you have this little conscious awareness of, I know this must happen so I can grow, so that my self I can feel more free and more fulfilled, because anything that is the ego is limited, which the soul is always thriving to expansion, and the ego is limiting that expansion. So of course the soul loves the ego death, but the ego hates it, of course. And it is also painful because with this identity you have constructed the whole belief system about yourself, the whole beingness of habits of how you treat yourself, how you eat, how you behave, what you transmit, what you are interested in. I mean, so many things I could count here now, because an identity is made of multiple things, as you know. And all these little things that make up your identity, your false self, fall away. And maybe it's just starting with one area of your life, but it can also be in multiple or all areas of life. And the more are concerned, obviously, the more threatened you feel, or this ego feels, your identity feels. It's also connected with an attachment to that identity, to the labels that have defined you. Because what our mind is trying to do, it wants to understand who we are. And when it doesn't have any labels, it doesn't really have anything to cling onto, to hold onto. So who are we? What are you? without any labels, without anything that identifies you, without name, without your job, without your accommodation, without your friends, without anything where you feel like, okay, this is me. Even all your traits, your needs, your desires, your dreams, your aspirations. When everything falls away, there is basically this paradox of nothingness and everythingness, which is your true identity. Not identity, it's your true nature, yeah? Identity is always false. So there's a threat the ego feels when all these labels fall away. And usually, to be honest, it's never a full falling away or apart, but more so a rearrangement, a realignment from one identity that is outgrown, outdated, to another identity that is more expanded. Because otherwise our human body, our nervous system especially, wouldn't be able, not capable of holding that much of information and higher frequency. Because with each shedding, with each ego death, with each step of remembrance, we invite more of light frequency into our body, because our essence is high vibrational. And we have contracted, condensed into this density of a physical body. So naturally our physical body has to catch up in a way when we internally transform, or on an energetic and spiritual level, when we there transform, our physical body and nervous system especially have to adjust. And that can also feel painful. Quite obvious, the more you believe you are your limited identity, your ego, the more you will resist this dissolution, this death, this change. And the more painful it also will be, the more suffering you will encounter. What can also sometimes happen is that ego death is in relation to Kundalini awakening. So if you have a Kundalini awakening, very naturally, Kundalini will clear the channel, will clear everything blocked inside your system, trauma, past pain, misalignments. Kundalini will trigger this purging process, and quite naturally, with that also comes ego death. In other words, we can also say the more conscious and aware you are about that this limited self is not the true you, the more you can trust the process and surrender into it, to work with it instead of against it. And in this process usually also comes more awareness of exploring and questioning, why is this happening, what for, and maybe even if you are sensitive, feeling the differences in your body, in your energy, before and in the process and afterwards. Usually afterwards we feel much lighter because we have shedded, we have released something that is not our true self. And then you will even have compassion for yourself. The ego usually fights and like, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this change. I don't want to feel this pain. I don't want this suffering. Why do I have to suffer? I have not done anything wrong. Why is it happening? Why is it happening now to me? And so forth. Complaining, so to say, and rebelling, resisting. But if you are aware of it, if you have researched maybe also about ego death and that it is part of your spiritual awakening, you will know and understand it's a process, it is temporary, and it will pass. And actually also after the pain, after the storm, comes calmness, comes much more peace, comes much more alignment, and therefore maybe also gratitude even for it. You cannot really accelerate this process, I would say, but surrendering, of course, always helps. And knowing what is happening. Because I feel people get fearful, frightened, when they don't know what is happening inside of them and they feel out of control. And control actually is also the ego. The ego wants to control that process, which is not possible. But if you know what's happening, you can release that control. You can soothe and maybe even have an internal conversation with your ego like, okay, I see you, I hear you, I know why you rebel, why you are fighting it. But let me tell you, from a soul's perspective, this is part of my ascension process. And then even you may get to a point where you feel how ridiculous the ego can be sometimes. Yeah, holding on so rigidly to something that is actually not serving you. But the trick is the ego, the mind, clings to something because it knows this is working and cannot foresee the future so much that it is already in the field. I mean, we can imagine something, but if it's really happening, we don't know. So we rather cling to something that we know and is proved and tested, so to say. Yet, it cannot see what's ahead. And if we are honest with ourselves, the divine has always a bigger plan, and we only understand it in hindsight. So when we look back at something, when we are out of this ego death or some other intense moments of our lives, only when we look back, we can fully understand and see the clear picture. So actually maybe what helps also, not only surrendering and trust, is also to be open to the mystery of life and to the paradox of life. Not always the mind can make sense of things, and that is part of life. So if you are currently in that phase of ego death, know that it is not you who really dies, but a distorted, limited view about yourself. A version of yourself that is outdated, that actually also in a way imprisons your soul to grow and expand. When we think of the collective evolution, then we can also say that for New Earth to be born, for this paradigm where more and more people live in the frequency of 5D, of the fifth dimension, then ego death has to happen. Because New Earth is rooted in truth, love, freedom, oneness, all that is innate to the soul, innate to the divine essence. So I would say all of us are going through it, all of us in some way or the other, in some iterations. Yeah, not all is at once, because that would also be an overwhelm for your system again, like I mentioned, but I feel it is very much dominant in the collective, but most people silently work through it. A lot in the spiritual world is behind scenes, yeah, because it's on an energetic inner level, an internal process. It is talked about, concepts are there, we share with each other, but the entire process you yourself have to go through. And some even, I guess, also if you're one of the few or maybe the only one in your surrounding having that experience of awakening, then maybe even more so you will withdraw, you will spend more time in silence and solitude to let yourself also be more in rest and in contemplation, so that this ego death can happen more or less smoothly. What I also want to mention here at the end is that it is not necessarily about a complete ego death, and this may even not be possible really, to be able still to walk as a human being and experience our individuality as a separate being. It is more so about developing a healthy ego, to become conscious about when you are in this limited I, in the identity you are playing here, and when you are in an expanded state of consciousness. And then, again, it becomes much more a conscious game of choosing, okay, now I'm more in my I, in my limited self, and experience this life from my limited perception, my filters, my little distortions, my conditioning. And then maybe in some cases, in your spiritual practice, especially in meditation, you can expand into the state of pure consciousness. So yes, you can explore with that. Always, when we are conscious about a concept, we can explore it and experience ourselves in from multiple perspectives, from multiple angles, and then, by that, getting a deeper understanding what our true nature is, what consciousness through us is. And I would also argue that in today's times, at least still, when a lot of people are still in ego structures, it is in a way sort of necessary for a healthy ego to set also healthy boundaries, that you are not overstepped, that even though you transmit that pure frequency of light, you still need some sort of healthy boundaries to protect that in a way. And yes, at some point I can imagine when humanity has very high consciousness in totality, in the majority of people, we don't even need so many boundaries anymore. That's my view of things, at least. So to make this limited self-identity construct experience, we need the ego. But if you're on the path to soul liberation, to soul alignment, the ego needs to fall away step by step, layer by layer. And each time you feel lighter, each time you feel freer, you feel much more you, the true you, like an inner knowing you, home vibration you. So that's why I say, when the ego dies, the soul can finally breathe. And I very much hope that if you're going through an ego death, you remember that phrase. It is for your soul to breathe again. So much love and bliss. Soraya Ananda. If you feel the deep pull to walk this spiral more intimately, Soulgasm, my 6-month one-on-one sacred mentoring awaits you. This is a living embodiment of all I transmit here, but uniquely decoded for your soul. Enter the portal of ecstatic bliss and unleash your personal soulgasmic reality. All details and the link to book your vibrational match call are in the show notes.